often have we talked about this, where the left is in the business of attributing motive? And we go to great lengths here to say, listen, I think someone might just be misinformed. I think they're wrong before we assume that they're liars. I think this is a great example of that. Let's start off. Jimmy Kimmel talked about his son who was sick, who through medical intervention was saved. And this is how I first saw the story.
Yeah, it went viral.
This clip, it went viral, and everybody was on board. Let's watch.
He got to the hospital very quickly. They did an echocardiogram, which is a sonogram of the heart, and found that Billy was born with a heart disease. So this poor kid, this is what he looked like on Monday. But this is what he looked like yesterday.
And I think that's great.
Sure.
I think it's beautiful that he was able to talk about. I'm so happy for his son. When I first saw the story, that's all I saw. I didn't see the extended clip where he takes that and he leverages his son's story to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, Trump sucks.
President Trump last month proposed a $6 billion cut in funding to the National Institute of Health. And thank God our congressman made a deal last night to not go along with that. They actually increased funding by $2 billion, and I applaud them for doing that. You know, before 2014, if you were born with congenital heart disease like my son was, there was a good chance you'd never be able to get health insurance because you had a pre-existing condition. If your baby is going to die, and it doesn't have to, it shouldn't matter how much money you make. I think that's something that, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else, we all agree on that, right?
Well, we all agree. We should also all agree on some facts. That's true. In the United States, it doesn't really matter how much money you make. What does matter is if you live in the United States, because that's the single biggest determining factor in whether that baby lives or dies. So this is, again, attributing motive. Let's assume for a second that, and we'll get into the ins and outs of socialized healthcare and medical research and actually what comes from the private sector versus the public sector. But let's assume for a second that there's a debate to be had, okay? Mm-hmm. Let's assume that there's a conversation to be had that, well, you know what, there's a lot of medical research, a lot of vaccines that have come from the public sector, and we can have that argument, and you can have some brilliant economists have that conversation. It still doesn't mean that people who come on the other side of the equation hate babies and want them to die. It doesn't mean that conservatives, Republicans, or limited government advocates want to see little babies hauled out on mini stretchers. What it means is we see a different way to more effectively treat them. We see a better way to provide health care. And we don't see that like someone who was raised in Canada, someone who has watched bodies put under the ground because of socialized healthcare, because of not getting access to treatment in time for necessary healthcare in the face of terminal illness. I don't attribute every single Quebecois. I don't attribute to them motive that they hate my aunt, that they hate my relatives who couldn't see a doctor for their scan to find out what cancer they had. I just assume they're incorrect. But let's get into the math of that. That's important to note. Most valid medical research takes place in the private sector. Berkeley themselves, they cite nearly 75% of clinical trials are privately funded. Now, let me sort of cut you off at the pass. I know what leftists are going to say here. Well, yeah, but if you look at all the vaccines, all of these cures, they were all created before modern, privately funded clinical trials, the big medical industrial complex. Okay. AEI, American Enterprise Institute, has a great paper on this. I highly recommend you read it. So if it sounds like I'm paraphrasing quite a bit of it here, I am. But there are three eras of sort of medical research in the United States. And you have sort of the first era, which is basically the Wild West. Let's figure it out. Then you have the second era, where it's true. The majority of research came from publicly funded institutions in the United States. And that's because at that time, the publicly funded institutions provided the research and the private sector provided the manufacturing horsepower that they knew the government couldn't. So it kind of think like a war effort, only instead of tanks and Nazis, polio and vaccines. That was the relationship back then. As a matter of fact, Franklin Roosevelt's science advisor, Vannevar Bush, called in 1945 for a sharply increased federal investment in research. Bush's treaty entitled Science, the Endless Frontier, emphasized the importance of basic research unlinked to practical ends as the best route to innovation. And this is important here for people who might miss this. This is why you can find numbers that seem to be conflicting. This when you're talking about this... sort of, I guess, entreaty is what it's called. I want to get the technical term right. When you're talking about this, it's basically increasing funding for research with no means to an end. It doesn't necessarily have to mean medical research, biological medical research. It doesn't necessarily have to have a means to an end in the terms of finding a cure to a disease or finding any treatment to a disease. by and large, the purpose of medical research in the publicly funded community, in the academic community, is to impress academia with your published research. As a matter of fact, you'll find numbers that say, well, look at all this research conducted in the public sector. A lot of that doesn't directly relate to medicine at all, and certainly not biological, medicinal research that would lead to treatment of diseases. That's why the numbers might not bear out if you do some research, because by 1990, corporate investment in medical research actually exceeded that of the public sector. It's now over twice as large. 3 separate analyses concluded that 85% of the drugs approved by the FDA since 1988 arose solely from research and development formed within the industry. So I know, you're going to take your curcumin, smoke your pot, you don't believe in drugs, that's fine. This isn't the video for you. The USA accounts alone, so when you compare it with socialized healthcare countries, they account alone for 30% of global research and development in the medical community. The U.S. has way more MRI units per patient. I remember when I was in Quebec, you'd have to wait over a year to get an MRI. I think it was something like 10 to 20 times the amount of MRIs. There were only 10 in the entire country, and I'm talking about in the early 2000s when I was raised in Quebec. Emergency waiting room times, people who waited for over 5 hours in an emergency room. In Canada, it's over 19%. In Quebec, it's over 35%. So again, if we're going to talk about motive, which is what the left wants to do with Jimmy Kimmel, listen, it's really easy to take a personal story and say, can you believe that Donald Trump doesn't... Listen, your son wasn't saved by medical research that was created from a grant from Barack Obama. Your son was very likely saved from formidable medical advancements that occurred under a free enterprise society thanks to capitalism and people who had some kind of ambition, some kind of incentive to go forth and innovate. And the fact that we say we should create an atmosphere for more medical innovation by, let's say, lowering corporate tax rates, by, let's say, creating economic incentives for people to do this. The fact that we say, you know what, let's create an atmosphere for more of that doesn't mean that we hate children. Maybe it means that we just understand a more effective way to treat them than you do. And I could trot out a personal sob story. I could say, you know what, my aunt took her 8 weeks to even see a doctor. When they saw a spot of lung cancer on her, at that point it had already metastasized, and it took another 4 weeks for them to even determine what kind of treatment she could go going forward. And because it was advanced, she effectively sat in front of death panels. I know people say there are no death. They're not called death panels. But when you're under socialized healthcare, guess what? They have to ration healthcare because it's at the taxpayer expense. They don't have a whole lot of it. And if you're facing a terminal illness and your only chance is some experimental medical treatment, you're out of luck. And a bureaucrat decides whether you live or die. I could take that anecdotal story and just tell you that socialized healthcare completely sucks. I would argue that, but not because of that anecdotal story, but because of all of the research that I provided. Again, don't be in the business of simply questioning motives. Even people who are going to be commenting in the comment section here. If you're going to argue from a technological perspective of medical advancement. Argue from a statistical perspective. I'd love to see that argument. I can see both sides, but not because something sad happened. Hey, if you like this video, subscribe by clicking the button that says subscribe. If you're not aware of it now, there's no way you're learning the internet at this point. I'm not going to help you. But this was clipped from my daily show, available exclusively to louderwithcrowder.com/mugclub members. If you're a student, military, or veteran, enter in that promo code. It's less than $6 a month, and you get daily content. No more clips, plus this hand-etched mug. Oh, when I feel it, I got a chill like on the inside.